Well, have we got Rory in the room? Oh, Rory, you're on. Well, while Rory makes his way down here, let me introduce Dr. Rory McLellan, who's going to talk about who persecuted the Jews and why. Now, Rory is, along with Dean, an academic lead for the Jewish Square Mile project. And he was the first to approach us very politely, very tentatively, could he help? And we just gobbled up that kind offer. And he has been a stalwart of this project so that one can be sure that what we've produced and what we put forward in our exhibition on our website, whenever we talk as individuals, the guides who take the guided tours, reflects the best in modern scholarship. Rory is a postdoctoral research associate at Royal Holloway, holds a PhD in medieval history from the University of St Andrews, and for 2 years between 2020 and 2022 was a postdoctoral researcher at historic royal palaces, researching the Jewish history of the Tower of London. He's also the author of Warrior Monks, Politics and Power in Medieval Britain, a book I very much recommend about the Knights Hospitaller, and a specialist steeped in medievalism. And he's going to talk about, obviously, a subject about which we care a lot. So, Rory, thank you. Thank you.
Okay. Right, this is a slightly shorter paper, I think, than everyone else's has been.
I could have just kept going. I've done it.
But hopefully that does mean there's more time for questions, and also, considering the topic, it's not necessarily one you want to dwell on for an exceedingly long amount of time. So the persecution I'm talking about, one of the key areas that it's born out of is that the English jury has this really unusual legal status, which is first recorded in an early 12th century legal compilation called the Laws of Edward Confessor. It actually has nothing to do with him, it's just that this is later people calling back to an earlier king just to give it more authority. And in this particular clause it says that all Jews, in whichever kingdom they may be, ought to be under the guardianship and protection of the liege king, because the Jews and all their possessions are the king's. So a little bit like medieval understanding of a villain, a serf that is bound to a particular lord along with all of their things and also all their family. Now, for the English kings, this is a bit more of an aspiration than a reality. It takes quite a while for them to actually put this into some sort of effect. But by the 13th century, most juries were overseen by the local royal official, usually the sheriff or the constable of the royal castle. And as the Jewish population was considered the king's servants, he can then tax them much more easily than their Christian counterparts. If he wants to tax the barons or the church, he'll have to actually get some of them on side, and once Parliament develops, go through Parliament. The Jews have no such defenders, and so he can just go straight to the source there. And then coupled with the wealth that, as we've heard, some Jewish men and women managed to get through business and money lending, this then meant that the community could be a financial resource for the crown to exploit. And much of this taxation on the Jews came in the form of tallages. It's just arbitrary taxes that vary in size, don't have a regular pattern, they're imposed entirely at the king's will. And a tallage could be up to, say, a third of the value of every Jew's movable goods, as it was in 1273 and 74. If you didn't pay, you could be imprisoned until you paid up. If you didn't have the actual ready cash or the goods to pay, then you can instead offer up the debts that had been given to you. You might think that a way of getting out of this is, well, perhaps you could try and convert and you leave the community. If you do that, all your property is forfeited to the king. If you die, you also don't get out of it then either, because a third of your estate should then go to the king as well. If you end up being convicted of a crime and executed, all of your goods go to the king. So there's not really any way out of this. And so this ended up giving the English kings a deeply cynical relationship with the Jewish community in medieval England. They want to protect them from anti-Jewish attacks and riots, but only so that they can exploit them financially. So in 1203, after King John had heard rumours that Jews in London were being attacked, he writes to the city to warn them that he'd hold the mayor and citizens responsible for any further bloodshed. That seems like quite a nice sort of thing to do. But when he says it, he also likens Jewish people to dogs, saying that if we give our peace even to a dog, it should be kept inviolate. So you can see that sort of real, sort of perverse protection, but also persecution and denigration in that relationship. And attacks on the Anglo-Jewry did occur, particularly in civil wars. The king is their main protector, though that doesn't stop him from exploiting them, but he is their main protector. So when you have a civil war, when royal authority collapses, the community is robbed of its main protection. And we find that in both of the Barons' Wars, so First Barons' War, King John, that then leads to Magna Carta, and the Second Barons' War between Simon de Montfort and Henry III in the 1260s, that at both instances the community does suffer and comes under attack from barons. And this is less done straight just out of anti-Jewish hatred. It's also economic warfare against the king, because you're actually going after some of the resources that he can then use to fund his war effort. When de Montfort manages to then take power, he ceases those attacks, and then they restart again when the war begins again. So it's done very much as this sort of attack upon the king's finances. Now, the barons who rebelled against John in 1215, when they occupy London on the 17th of May and win over the support of the mayor and the aldermen and the citizens, they end up looting the houses of the city's Jews and take the stones to repair the city walls against the feared royal counterattack. In the Second Barons' War between de Montfort and Henry III, the city falls to the Montfortians in April 1264, and many of the Jews flee to the Tower of London. One of the Montfortian knights, John Fitzjohn, ends up slaying the Jewish Londoner Cock, son of Aaron, with his own hands. And Cock's son Benedict was only a child at the time of the murder and was still traumatized by it several years later. So when Henry III died in 1272, his successor, Edward I, is still abroad. And so with their sort of protector, exploiter gone, this power vacuum could have led to anti-Jewish violence, as it had sometimes in the past. So understandably, Benedict flees to the Tower of London and seeks shelter there. And he's still hiding there for at least 2 weeks after the king has died, at which point nothing has happened. There has been no riots or anything like that. But for Benedict, at least, there's still a great deal of fear and a lasting impact of what he had experienced as a child. And any sort of collapse in royal authority is still really deeply felt by the community. But of course, the Crown, in turn, could prosecute and persecute the Jewry themselves, most notoriously during the moral panic of the coin clipping trials. And you've got an example of a clipped coin here. So when Edward I did return to England from Crusade in 1274, he soon found that the currency didn't have quite as much precious metals in it as it should have. It had been debased. And he ordered investigations that eventually uncovered evidence of coin clipping. And coin clipping was when you would cut the edges off coins to sell the silver or just melt it down to make new coins. And it was considered a very serious crime. And economically it was quite damaging because medieval currency, the value of it is directly linked to the amounts of precious metals in it. So initially the investigation looks at people that work very closely with money. So it looked at the workers of the Royal Mint. It then looked at merchants. But it then shifted to disproportionately target the Jewish community. And coin clipping even then becomes being interpreted through an anti-Jewish lens. So it's considered that Jews are circumcising Christian coinage by cutting off the edges. Yeah. So according to chroniclers, during this time, the whole Anglo-Jewish community was arrested and imprisoned. Medieval chroniclers are terrible at numbers. They do often exaggerate, but from other records, from financial ones, we know that there are at least 600 Jewish prisoners at the Tower in 1278 to 1279. So 600, considering that there's probably 3,000 Jewish people in England at this time, that's at least a fifth of the community in just one castle. And so the idea that actually maybe all of the community was arrested doesn't seem quite as implausible. And in the end, almost 300 Jews were executed at the Tower for coin clipping, along with only a handful of Christians, showing the disproportionate legal treatment of the communities. That this was something that we do know from trial records Christians engaged in quite a lot, and yet they do not end up suffering quite as many executions as the Jewish community does. And one of the more everyday ways that Jews faced persecution was from the efforts of the Crown and the Church to try and keep them separate from their Christian neighbours. So most famously, the Fourth Lateran Council in 1215 mandated that Jews and Muslims in Christian-ruled lands should wear something to distinguish themselves, something in their clothing. And in England, from 1218, the Crown tried to put that into action, ruling that Jews should wear a badge which would resemble the two tablets of the law to identify themselves from Christians. But this seems to be a bit more the case of the Crown just trying to placate the church, as they didn't really put any effort into actually enforcing it. And individuals and communities could pay to be exempt from having to wear it. So in 1221, the Jews of Canterbury, Oxford, and London all make such a payment that they just don't need to wear it at all. Other restrictions tried to ban Jewish-Christian interactions through work or through trade. So 1271, you have Henry III banning Christians from using Jewish bakers, cooks, nursemaids, and brewers, which is quite interesting as it implies that there are people working in those jobs, so it gives us an idea of some of the other jobs that the community might have. And around nursemaids, that's something that they're really quite sensitive at the time, particularly because some ideas of medieval biology assume that you will actually be influenced by who has breastfed you in terms of like your characteristics and so on, your personality and things. So there's some weird medieval biology ideas behind that. And then a set of ordinances issued by the Mayor of London in 1277 forbade butchers from buying meat from Jews to sell it to Christians, or buying meat that had been slaughtered by Jews but rejected as unkosher. But one of the really big questions in this is, were these sorts of restrictions actually enforced? So there is a common misconception today that really does sort of basically look like this, that medieval kings and the church are all powerful. Everyone goes to church multiple times a day. The slightest religious infraction or sign of heresy will be noticed and punished. Kings and knights can do whatever they want to the peasantry and enforce law without mercy. But this is actually a better description of modern totalitarian governments. This level of political and social control is not possible with medieval institutions and technology. Kings and bishops can pass as many laws and rules as they like, but actually enforcing them is a different matter. And we can see this repeatedly in the case of medieval London's Jewish population. So the Lord Mayor bans Christians from renting houses from Jews and Jews from renting outside the Jewry around the Guildhall. But we keep on finding examples of both things happening. The Archbishop of Canterbury tried to ban Christians from selling to Jews in 1222. So the Jews of Lincoln complained to the king, and the king orders that the ban be ignored, because understandably, he doesn't want his community to be starved. And so then when these sort of get this conflict between the church and the king, as long as the king's not in a very weak position, he's generally going to not go for some of these more implausible, more unreasonable attempts at trying to separate the communities that the church keeps making. The records of the sergeants of the Tower of London, who have a responsibility for actually policing and managing the London Jury, they show a constant flow of traffic in and out of the jury for trade, and it also seems for friendship. We find Christians being fined for being found in Jewish houses at night, or bringing money to the jury to exchange. And the fines might have been seen more as just the price of doing business rather than a real deterrent. And with a lot of medieval government, if there is a rule, there's normally an exemption where you can buy your way out of that rule as well. And more famously, in Hereford in 1286, the Jewish man Aaron Blund was about to hold an elaborate wedding party for his son Elias. And so the local bishop warns that any Christian attendees will be excommunicated. But this didn't prove much of a deterrent. So the city's leading citizens joined the celebrations, some of them on horseback in all their fineries. They're not even trying to sneak in. They enjoy the games, the plays, listen to the Christian musicians that Aaron had hired for the occasion. And afterward, the bishop demands that anyone who went has to then go and perform absolution within a week. So he's already backed down on excommunicating them, realizing it's just not actually plausible. Now, as well as these legal pressures on Jewish economic and social lives, they could also face more overtly, more direct religious persecution. So in 1272, the king seized the Londoners' Great Synagogue on Colechurch Lane, which you can see marked at the S1 there. And this had been seized because their neighbours, the friars of Sac, who Emma has mentioned, had complained for a long time about what they described as the Jews' continual howling and wailing during services, disrupting their own mass. And so the synagogue simply gets seized, and it takes a while for the community a few years to arrange another communal synagogue of the same scale. And individuals could also be persuaded or pressured to leave their community and convert to Christianity. This one's actually a fictional depiction of a conversion of I think he ends up becoming one of Arthur's knights, who's meant to be Muslim. But we do know of lots of real examples of medieval English Jews that will have been converted and gone through this, or adult baptism. So Henry III took a particular interest in conversion. He often presided over baptisms of converts, acting as their godfather, and he would name them after courtiers, saints' days, his own father, John, and if he really liked them, he'd give them his own name of Henry. And then often they would then be sent to live in different monasteries around the country, because upon conversion, they have given up all of their goods, so they can't actually support themselves anymore. Later on, this is downgraded to, I think, only half of their goods, but still. And so to help support the community, in 1232, Henry founds the Domus Conversorum, which again we've heard mentioned, so the house of the converts. So sort of a semi-monastic almshouse in Chancery Lane, where the old Public Record Office would later stand. And here Jewish converts to Christianity would receive a small stipend from the crown and basically live in an almshouse sort of environment. But later kings failed to maintain them. They get more and more complaints about them having to turn to begging. But despite this, new converts keep on arriving from abroad well into the 16th century, initially from Low Countries, some from France, and then particularly from Spain and Portugal. Now, more rarely, Jews could be targeted for supposed religious transgressions, so most notoriously the blood libel cases of William of Norwich in 1144 and Little St. Hugh of Lincoln in 1255, both based around spurious accusations that the local Jewish communities had sacrificed a Christian boy. And despite this lack of evidence, 18 Lincoln Jews were hanged at the Tower of London in 1255 for this. The two saints' cults that resulted from these episodes were not, however, prominent or successful in the medieval period, nor were two even more obscure cults with similar stories, those of Robert of Bury and Harold of Gloucester. They received few donations, their shrines were rarely visited by pilgrims, they had few churches dedicated to them or accounts of their lives written, so it seems that most English Christians either did not believe in or did not value their stories and their potential religious value for intercession. There's another quite unusual case in Norwich in 1230, which saw several Jews accused of kidnapping a Christian boy and circumcising him. So this is clearly still coming from that context of this blood libel idea of some sort of suspicion where of interacting with a Christian child. So supposedly a Christian doctor called Benedict claimed that his son, Odard, a 5-year-old, was playing on a street in Norwich, whilst Jacob of Norwich, a Jew, then took Odard to his house, circumcised him, and renamed him Jernapin. And all medieval Jewish names are often quite weird because they're being written by someone who doesn't know Hebrew and is having to turn it into Latin or into French. And that's how you can have Isaac being known as Isaac, Hagen, Hake, Cock, or Cockerel. All of it being Isaac or Yitzhak. Which makes it very, very difficult to trace individuals and make sure that it's the same person when they've got 5 different names. So then supposedly Jacob then kept this boy there for day and night until Benedict, informed by his neighbours, came looking for his son. And he took Odard before the coroners and the representative of the Archdeacon of Norwich, so you've got royal officials and then also a church official, and they testify that, yeah, the boy is circumcised and that it seems to have been done recently. And Benedict accused several other Jews of helping Jacob. But the trial later found some holes in Benedict's story. So the constable of Norwich Castle testifies that the Jews came to him at the castle and said that the Christians were trying to steal one of their number. And so you wonder, why would these people who had supposedly kidnapped a child go to the authorities to ask for help to keep the kidnapped child? So it seems much more likely that the boy was indeed a Jew and that the Christians had effectively abducted him, with the community appealing to the constable, the king's local representative, for help. But despite this, the court found against them, and most of the Jews were executed after several years in prison. Now, particularly darker bit of this is that you might have the idea in English history burning at the stake might seem like something of more a Tudor era thing, of Catholics and Protestants burning each other during the Reformation, or maybe in the 1400s when you have some English heretical groups like the Lollards. But I've actually found that the first 2 recorded executions by burning in England are not of Christian heretics, but of Jews. So the Annals of Dunstable record that in 1221, an unnamed deacon had fallen for a Jewish woman, converted, and had himself circumcised. And then for what was seen as this apostasy, he was then sentenced by a church council to burning at the stake the following year. In 1275, another Christian, Robert of Reading, he's a Dominican friar who's very knowledgeable in Hebrew, because, of course, because of the Christian appropriation of what they refer to as the Old Testament, they have a great scholarly interest in studying the text and trying to read Jesus back into it. And so you do actually have quite a lot of churchmen who are very knowledgeable in Hebrew at this time. And he accidentally converts himself by being persuaded by studying the original text so much. And again, he is circumcised, he marries a Jewish woman, he takes the name of Haggai, and he's arrested and handed over to the church courts. We don't know what happened to him. There isn't a record that shows the rest of his story, but considering what had happened, he probably also ended up at the stake. And then finally, sometime after 1279, so this is during the coin clipping crisis, the prominent Norwich Jew, Abraham, son of Dulacres, was burnt. He owned several properties in Norwich, especially in the area now called Abraham's Hall, so between the Haymarket and Horse Market, southwest of the site of Norwich's medieval synagogue. And Abraham had been imprisoned by 1277, accused of coin clipping, but these then morphed into different charges, and sometime after February 1279, he was found guilty of blasphemy. Doesn't say anything more, just that there's no detail of what exactly happened. And he was then drawn and burnt. But amongst this, as you've seen, often very horrific persecution, we can also find evidence of coexistence and cooperation between the two communities, even in the most dire circumstances. So in April 1267, London fell to a rebel army, and only the Tower of London held out, commanded by the mayor, the alderman, and the papal representative, Otto Bruno. The rebels, commanded by Gilbert de Clare, Earl of Gloucester and Hertford, laid siege to the castle, beginning a heavy bombardment that the tower's weaker siege engines struggled to answer. And for 2 months, the walls, mostly along the western side, so the left side here, of the castle, were defended by grizzled sergeants and desperate citizens, and in a seemingly unique episode in medieval England, by the city's Jews, who had raced to the tower soon after de Clare had attacked London. Now, the Tower of London had offered the Jews shelter before, as a precautionary measure in 1220, at Henry III's second coronation, and in 1235 at the coronation of his Queen Eleanor of Provence, and as a vital refuge from the riots which followed Richard I's coronation in 1189. Now, that violence then soon spread across England, culminating in the tragic massacre and mass suicide of the York Jewry in the keep of York Castle, Clifford's Tower, in March 1190. And this earlier episode has cast a long shadow, understandably, over the history of the Jews of medieval England, offering a version of the story dominated by discrimination, hatred, and violence. But the Jews who stood together and defended London in 1267 points to another, more complex narrative. And this collaboration, the only recorded instance of Jews and Christians defending a castle together in medieval England, highlights some of the relationships built between Jews and their Christian neighbours. And whilst persecution and brutal attacks did occur, there were also instances of everyday collaboration, of coexistence and friendship between the two communities. Now, Gilbert de Clare had initially been a supporter of the rebellious Simon de Montfort in the Second Barons' War, but he later switched sides, went back to supporting the king. And by 1267, the war is over, Montfort's been dead for 2 years, but the peace settlement has led to some of the rebels holding out. So the peace settlement of the Dictum of Kenilworth in 1266, which de Clare actually helped draft, he felt it was too harsh, particularly its treatment of the rebels, called the Disinherited, because their lands were confiscated as a penalty. Ironically, de Clare actually now held quite a lot of those lands, so he could have just given some of them back. But now, under this settlement, the disinherited could buy back their estates, but they had to pay before they could resume possession. But if you lost all your lands, you don't have your income, so how are you going to get the money to do so? And so because of these flaws, there were still holdouts in the Isle of Ely, and de Clare eventually turns to rebellion himself. So in the winter of 1266-7, no sign that there's going to be any sort of compromise on the peace, he then withdraws to the Welsh marches, raises an army, and marches on London in April. And the papal representative, Otto Bono, lets de Clare enter the city, mistakenly thinking that he's still loyal to the king. But the Earl soon seized the keys to the other gates, and then some of the rebels from Ely, under the command of John de Aville, had marched south and encamped in Southwark, and the Earl now let them cross London Bridge and enter the city. He also began freeing imprisoned Montfortians and replacing the city's government with his supporters, and all the remaining loyalists, led by Otto Bono, flee into the Tower, and many Jews soon follow. And they had quite good reason to flee. The jury was soon sacked, and they knew that among the rebels who were in the city was John Fitzjohn, so the murderer of Cock, son of Aaron, 3 years earlier. So with the Tower now held against him, de Clare had to settle down for a siege. The houses of the prominent London Jews Solomon Blund and Rabbi Elias were torn down by rebel knights, and the timber was used for siege works. And the Westminster continuation of Matthew Paris's Chronicle Flores Historiarum is the only account of the siege to record participation of the Jews. So the legate, with certain nobles faithful to the king, entered the Tower of London. Also, no small number of Jews, with wives and children, went inside after the legate. They were entrusted with a bailey of the castle, which, though hard-pressed, they defended eagerly. Now, the garrison doesn't seem to have been a large one. We know in mid-March that year there were 35 royal sergeants there, 15 of which were mounted. Medieval sergeant at this point is not sort of like an NCO rank like it is today. In this case, it is a man-at-arms. It is a armed servant. So you've only got 35 royal sergeants, and that's about what it looked like at the time. And so you can imagine trying to defend all of those walls with just 35 people. So the Earl's attack had come as a surprise. They probably hadn't reinforced the castle by much. So the Jews would have been a welcome contribution to this very small garrison. And as in other medieval sieges, such would be the desperation of the situation, that everyone would have joined in the defence in some capacity, regardless of the sexism or other prejudices of the time. So we can expect that women, children, and the elderly would have joined the defence if they were able, whether by carrying supplies and ammunition or actually holding the walls themselves. Now, the besiegers focused their attacks on the western walls of the tower, particularly around where the gates was then, because it's since moved. And we know that they built earthworks and a wooden enclosure between the city and the castle, perhaps to house their siege engines, and also to try and a sort of a covered pathway to try and get up to the walls. Now, the eastern walls outside the city apparently weren't being besieged at all, as Henry III and his army were able to approach them in early May, a distraction that allowed Otto Bono to flee the tower via Rivergate and reach the king. So therefore, it's probably on what is now the inner curtain wall of the tower that the Jews once stood. And Dr. Sally Dixon-Smith, who's a former curator at the site, suggests that the wall between the Beaumont and the Devereux towers is the most likely spot. So that's between 14 and 15, because this second outer wall and the wharf, that's all built in the 1270s, mostly with Jewish tax money, but it was not there at the time. So it's between 14 and 15, and if you do go to the tower now, they do actually have a panel commemorating it with a little bit of artwork and everything. So it is actually mentioned there. And now that Otto Bono has got out of the castle, he withdraws with the king to Ham Abbey in Stratford. Now, unable to blockade a city as large as London, and knowing that he would face fierce resistance from the Londoners, Henry begins negotiations, and on 15th of June, in return for guarantees from the Earl, the rebels are pardoned and promises are given that the problem of the peace settlement will be looked at. The siege of the tower is lifted, the fort and the earthworks dismantled, and the Jews could return to their homes. And then on 1st of July, it's announced that all the rebels that had lost their lands could now get them back first and then pay for it, and there'd even be a tax raised to help them. So what did it mean for the Jewish and Christian Londoners to have stood together on the tower's walls? The castle had offered the community before, most famously following the riots at Richard I's coronation, but we have no prior record of Jews assisting in the defence in that instance. Yet the fact of the siege would have been by far the more unusual experience, as the two communities regularly mixed as neighbours, business partners, and more. So it's not only in desperate sieges that Jews and Christians interacted in medieval England, and there are many examples of more everyday neighbourliness between the two communities, whether that was collaboration in the form of just simple coexistence, or forming social and emotional relationships, or pragmatic cooperation. So I've already mentioned the Hereford wedding of Elias Blund and the many Christians who attended in spite of the bishop's threats. And unfortunately, there is no contemporary illumination of what that wedding would have looked like, but this was sort of the closest I could find of the later German Jewish wedding. Now, there's even a few records of sexual relationships between medieval Jews and Christians, something that deeply concerned the authorities and was actually severely punished. So such cases occurred in 1221 with this deacon who converted that I mentioned earlier, and in 1236 to 7, when a Bristolian Jew and a Christian woman were caught in bed together, a case that ended with him abjuring the realm, so going into exile abroad forever, and her doing penance and abjuring Bristol. And 1256, when Abraham Russell, a Wiltshire Jew, paid a fine to secure a pardon for his relations with Letitia of Surfminster. And the Crown, as I mentioned already, tried to prevent Jews from employing Christians. So Henry III's ban on Christians working for Jews as nurses, bakers, brewers, or cooks, and similar orders banning Christians wet nursing Jews were made by the king in 1253 and the Bishop of Worcester in 1219. The first of these in 1253 is at a point where the king is quite desperate to have the church on side so he can get a tax out of them. So it seems to be part of a wider set of anti-Jewish regulations that are more there because of the church than because of the king actually wanting to enforce them. But these sort of interactions persist, no matter how much the king and church try to limit or regulate relationships between the two communities. So you've got these bans on wet nursing. 25 Christian women are excommunicated just in the 1270s for being wet nurses in Jewish households. Licoricia of Winchester employs a Christian maid, Alice of Bicton. Christians went to Jewish doctors for treatment. As already mentioned, Master Elias travelling abroad in 1280 to treat the Count of Hainaut. And in London, Christians regularly visited the jury. Now, the role of the Sergeant of the Tower only survives for 1275 to, we don't know when exactly it ends, but probably 78, maybe 79. And it's a real shame because it gives us such an insight to just these few years. So if only it had survived for a few more. We can see all of these sort of interactions every day, instances of Christians being caught in the jury at night or in Jews' houses, fighting between Jews and Christians, one Jew, Jossie of Bedford, spitting at a Christian, and one Christian paying a fine on behalf of a Jew. So the two communities interacted, both in positive and negative ways, just like any neighbours do. Many Jews end up doing business with Christians entering the jury. Sometimes this business is less than licit, like Adam de Candice, who was fined for exchanging money with Samuel of York. Two Christians caught taking silver into the jury were probably there to exchange this for coin. And doing this would be encroaching on the royal exchanges, so it's doing the king out of income, so that's one of the reasons it's clamped down on. And as we already heard, criminal collaborations between Christians and Jews were not unheard of either. After Cox, son of Aaron, was murdered by John Fitzjohn in 1264, and the remaining Jews of the city are hiding in the Tower of London, they undertake a night expedition of Jews and Christians to go to Cox's house and dig up the £1,000 worth of gold and silver he's got buried in his back garden. And this is illegal because, firstly, a third of that is supposed to, now that Cox has died, a third of that is supposed to pass to the king. But also, they've buried the gold, so it's now actually treasure trove, so again, it should all pass to the king. And this is them doing it whilst they're hiding in a royal castle. So they're really doing it right under the nose of the royal officials. Then in 1276, Roger of Somerset, a Christian, is brought from his prison in Oxford to Westminster to testify at the Exchequer of the Jews, and he confesses to being a thief, and he accuses 3 Jewish men, Vives le Lung, Jossie of Hereford, and Isaac of Caen, of buying the goods that he had stolen. Another trio of Jews, Jose, Baitcock, Benedict of Bedford, and his brother Jacob, were arrested in Bedford in 1283 alongside a Christian called William the Jailer. The group was charged with defrauding some foreign merchants who'd given them a large amount of money on the promise that they would then deliver some silver made from coin clippings. Just having that is a crime in itself. But the 4 men just took the money and ran. And then a much less glamorous heist came when 2 Christians and 2 Jews worked together to steal 6,000 herring from a market stall and take it to the house of a Jewish couple, presumably for them to sell, and presumably to sell very quickly before it starts to smell. Now, of course, these examples of collaboration aren't to downplay or overlook anti-Jewish attacks like that at Clifford's Tower, but to show that such horrors were the exception rather than the norm. The largest archival sources for medieval Anglo Jewry are the surviving records of debts and the plea rolls of the Exchequer of the Jews, the court that regulates disputes between Jews and between Jews and Christians. But only a fraction of Jews engaged in money lending, even fewer as their main business, and only a small number ever ended up before the Exchequer of the Jews. And so, as Dean pointed out this morning, the biases of archival survival can too easily skew our understanding of medieval English Jewry. The Exchequer of the Jews in particular represents the point when relations have collapsed entirely, where Jews and Christians have to resort to legal means to resolve their disputes. But the events of 1267 show a different instance of collapse, one where the 2 communities still work together. Collaboration existed not just in easy, everyday business or social settings, but also in moments of real danger. And this cooperation in crises was built upon commonplace neighbourliness. Medieval English Jews did labour under discriminatory and hostile system, but this did not prevent them building relationships with their neighbours. Their everyday lives were much more nuanced than that. So while telling the story of medieval English Jews, we should not only remember the horrors of Clifford's Tower and what that says about their experience, but also those Jews and Christians who stood together on the walls of a very different tower 8 decades later.
Thanks, Rory. Ladies and gentlemen, we've got nearly 15 minutes before we break for our afternoon coffee, and some of you will be going off on the guided walk. I'm sure you've got questions for Rory after that absolutely fascinating talk, so we mobilise our mic people straight away to come and pose questions. Here they come. So there's a lady down here. Oh, gentleman there first of all.
Thank you for an absolutely fascinating talk. I'd like to go back to the map of the Tower of London where you referred to the two towers and the location of the artwork that historic royal palaces have installed. Could you put it back up and be very specific where it is? Because as a guide, I'm taking people to the tower all the time.
So it's as you'd be going through the towers 19 through 16, I think it is. You go through, so the ones where it's the Royal Menagerie, and then the one after where I think it's still about First World War and soldiers at the tower then. And then afterwards, there's sort of steps that then lead you down, and that eventually ends up at the chapel. So it's on those on that little platform just at the top of the stairs there. And so it actually looks out right in the correct sort of place. You could see the sort of view with all the skyscrapers that they would have had at that point. And there's also another new panel down at the Elephant House, which is on the inside of where Tower 23 is, just between the green and the wall. And then, Dean, is there a third one? Okay, yeah, no, it's just those two.
That was fascinating, thank you. You were talking about the sergeant's roles and sort of finding people who went into old jewellery when they shouldn't be doing things. How was that policed? How did they find all that out?
This is one of the things where we just have to infer, because we don't actually even know how many tower sergeants there are at the time. I would imagine that part of it is that there will just be regular patrols in the same way that modern police would. Because you need to be, particularly because of the distance from the jury to the tower. It's, they will actually need to have people on the ground there to patrol it, because it's also useful as a fundraising exercise for them as well. Because a lot of the things that they fine for aren't necessarily stopping crimes being committed. It's just they find someone for gambling in the jury, that sort of thing. And so less of a sort of keeping everyone safe. Some of it is just they will have people there to just try and raise some money. And they have a really odd legal situation where the sheriffs of London are responsible for arresting people for crimes elsewhere in the city. And then you have this sort of bubble right at the centre of the city where only the Constable of Towers officials can do that. So they also sort of need to be there, because if there is a crime committed and there's a sheriff's man nearby, he actually can't do it. It's a very weird little enclave that they have of jurisdiction there.
Oh, sorry, apologies. Come to you next.
Just on the subject of blood libel, didn't it go even further than just the kidnapping and forced conversion and circumcision of young Jewish boys? Wasn't there also the claim that Jews were desecrating the Eucharist that is used, of course, in the so-called holy sacrifice of the Mass? And as those of you who may not know, in Catholicism, not in the Reformed Church, but in Catholicism, through something called transubstantiation, the belief is that the Eucharist actually becomes the body of Christ, and the wine actually becomes the blood of Christ. So in fact, Jews were just not forcing Christians were just not forcing the conversion of Jewish children. They were actually desecrating the body of Christ, which probably was a much worse crime. Is that not correct?
Yes, so the consecrated wafers do end up being in there. There's accusations that they use the blood of these Christian boys that they've killed to make the wafers as well. But the other, perhaps a more significant bit, is that in these murders, they supposedly crucify the boy as well. And so it's portrayed as if they're doing a mockery of what happens to Jesus. But really it is just a hodgepodge of like all the sort of the worst fears or would be most offensive to the medieval monks that seem to have invented these stories. And something like the host being violated is something that, again, it's a trope that they will throw in. It's the same when they talk about paganism, heresy, or witchcraft, that there's a real fear of the consecrated wafers being misused or being taken away and saved afterwards and used in something illicit or religiously illicit.
Cool, thanks very much for that. So there's a lot of what there. I was quite interested in the why, and particularly, the blood libel and all the other stuff going on. So why do those rumours start sort of like circulating at that time? What is it? Is it the kind of classic things are going wrong in the kingdom, let's blame the Jews, which, has seen quite a lot of replay over the centuries? Is it because there are certain resources or certain things that the Jews have which people covet, they're envious of? Is it the church wanting to reassert its power? There's kind of all these kind of things, but why did people start, why do they really catch hold, like those things? Because we're still talking about blood libel ideas now in modern conspiracy theories, but why did it start circulating then at that point, do we think?
So that's one that has been looked at quite a lot by historian R.I. Moore, who died a few years ago, and he coined the term the persecuting society, and this idea that when you get to about the 1000s, 1100s, medieval Christian Europe starts to target outgroups much more harshly, whether most famously Jews, but also Muslims, and then also lepers. And you just start to get this developing over time. In the case of Jews, it's sometimes, particularly the coronation of Richard I, been linked to crusade fervour around happening at the same time, which I don't think quite holds up, because quite a lot of the other instances aren't actually linked to major crusades going on. It's only really the First Crusade that is deeply tied to anti-Jewish attacks and to massacres. And certainly some of it is also going to be pure self-interest, that yes, there will be people targeting them because they may have something that they like. But one of the interesting things we can find is that the people that do end up targeting Jews are normally outsiders. It's not your neighbour from your town. It will be some guy that you've never met who doesn't know you. And that is the people who have the caricature of you built up from sermons that they will have heard at church, the stories they've been told and so on, in much the same way that you can look at today and see like the highest areas of anti-immigrant feeling in the country coincide with where there aren't actually very many migrants. That it's easier to demonise something that you don't actually know and it's just a stranger to you.
Hi. They found some skeletons in a well in Norwich when they made a new shopping centre, which they profiled, and they said that they were Jewish. So the term "throw the Jew down the well," was that like a regular occurrence?
I think that was quite recent, wasn't it? I remember seeing the story. Yeah, it looked like quite dodgy science to me, and from what I remember, the historical research on it looked quite dubious as well. The main instances I found of people in medieval period down wells actually have just been Christians committing suicide, dying by suicide. The evidence of them actually being Jewish seemed to be based on quite shaky science in that instance. So I don't think that it leads to much more, but at least one or two of the blood libel stories does involve the murdered child being found down a well, which I can only assume that it must be seen as a typical way to hide a body in a medieval town, because you can't just chuck it in the river because it might float. But if it's in the well, maybe it won't come back up.
We're going to have to wrap up there now so that we can try and stay to time. I mean, one comment I will add, forgive me because I've got the microphone, I'm going to do that, is we focus very much on celebrating that medieval community, but we can't ignore, as Rory so eloquently puts it, the persecutions and the violence. And we can qualify, we can understand, and we can still see where the community's achievements were, and we want to celebrate that. But overall, we want this history, which has not been known except to the specialist scholars, perhaps to the Haredim, who've been honouring the sages who are buried in that cemetery just a few metres away from us. And if you're interested in helping us bring this history back into the light where it should be, where we've all forgotten it, to be honest, then you have the opportunity to donate to the Jewish Square Mile. There is a sum-up machine there. But thank you very much. Come back for our last talk from Paul Dryburgh about the Jewish-shaped hole that was left in England in consequence of the expulsion in 1290. Rory, thank you. Sorry, you go to the downstairs.